Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of the Gospels, part 8, in our continuing study of the life of Christ. Today, we're going to look at the difference of thinking between people who live in the East versus those who live in the West. Let me just say for the record, I am a thoroughly Western thinking. I was born in the United States and grew up here for the most part. We lived for a little time in England, but I've been thoroughly indoctrinated with this, what we would call Western thinking. But when we go to the biblical times, whether Old Testament or even New Testament, we're going to see a great deal of Eastern thinking. There are places in the world where you'll still see that sort of thinking today. And I'm not saying one is bad and one is good. They are just different, and understanding will be helpful. In the West, we are individualistic by nature. Our culture is that. It's seen in our advertisements, it's seen in our culture, it's seen in the way we speak. We are very individualistic. Be all that you can be, not all that you all can be. As opposed to Eastern thinking, which tends to be much more collectivist in their thinking, in their culture. It's not a culture of I, it is a culture of we. In Western thinking, there is a tendency to be time-oriented. I've got several clocks in my house, one on the wall of each room, and I'm very time-oriented when it comes to time. I try to be on time and start my classes on time and not to go over. In the East, there is instead an idea of timeliness oriented. When you say we're going to meet at a certain time, well, that means sometime that afternoon or maybe that morning. And so not everybody owned a clock. In fact, I sometimes kid about the time elements in the Bible. There are some exceptions to this, but a lot of things happen at either 9 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon. In other words, at the third hour or the ninth hour, and nothing happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon ever. And it's because they didn't have clocks. They weren't that precise when it came to time. In Western thinking, we have a much greater emphasis on the rules. We have speed limits, and all you have to do is go to the Middle East and drive a little bit, and you see, oh my goodness! I remember where I especially saw this driving in Cairo. I wasn't doing the driving; I was in a taxi, but looking at the at the taxi cabs, and they have lanes in the road, but those are those are not really followed to any great degree. In Eastern thinking, instead, the emphasis is on relationship much more than in the West. You see, relationships, oh, they're nice here in the West, but it's much more about keeping the rules and doing this and doing that. In the East, it's much more, there's a much greater emphasis on the relationship that you have one with another. In Western thinking, our categories are right, this is right, that's wrong, don't do this, do that because it's wrong or right. In Eastern thinking, instead of right and wrong, and they do have those categories, but the emphasis, the importance is seen in the categories of honor and shame, and that doesn't relate to us in the West a great deal. Yes, I can be ashamed of something, but it doesn't force my hand. It doesn't force who I am in the way it does to people in the East. In the West, we tend to express truth in propositional terms. So, light and darkness, and I already said right and wrong, and things like that. In Eastern thinking, the tendency is to express truth in concrete terms, in things that you can see. And one of the ways I like to illustrate this is by asking the question, what is God? And sometimes I'll ask my students that, and they'll say, well, God is truth, and God is he is omnipresent, and he is omniscient, and those are all true. Those are all very true. In fact, that you can find places in the Bible that will specify that, but more often than not, the Bible won't put those propositions in that way. They won't express it in that way. Instead, they will very often express it in concrete terms. For example, I read in Psalm 18 and verse 2, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. You see, I can see a rock. I can see a fortress. deliverer, maybe, but I can see what a deliverer does. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. Think about the description there. Now, certainly, I could say that God preserves and He is dependable. But notice, this evokes a mental image because it is something you can see. Or I read in Psalm 121, beginning in verse 5, the Lord is your keeper, the Lord is notice, your shade on your right hand. The sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord is your shade. I live in Florida. We don't think that much about shade. We have air conditioning inside. But if you're out in the desert, that has a very different appeal. And shade in the desert is a very important thing. And God becomes very important when you are dealing with the pressures, the heat of a situation that comes down upon you. Psalm 23, verse 1, very familiar to us. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Doesn't mean that he has sheep, but it does give a picture of what God is doing. And of course, that psalm goes on, he leads me beside quiet waters. And again, when we think of quiet waters, like I said, I live in Florida. I think about going down to the beach and maybe the canals. But if you're in the desert, quiet waters can mean something very different in two different categories. You see, water is a bit hard to come by in the desert, but when you do come by it, you always have to look to see, are the waters really quiet? Or is this the result of what you sometimes see in the desert, a flash flood, where it might rain 10, 15, 20 miles away, and the waters seem to come out of nowhere. They're not quiet waters, they're raging waters that are quite dangerous. And the shepherd has to know the difference. We said that Western thinking expresses truth in propositional terms, Eastern thinking expresses truth in concrete terms. Western thinking expresses truth in absolute categories. It's either this or that. In Eastern thinking, oftentimes truth is expressed in generalities. And I want to notice some places where in the teaching of Jesus, this is evidently true. One example is seen Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, where Jesus said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she's committing adultery. So, divorce, it's not that divorce does it, but divorce and remarriage to another person equals adultery, according to Jesus in Mark chapter 10. However, when I read Matthew's account of the same teaching, that Matthew says essentially the same thing, unless one party was innocent. In other words, there could have been a time where somebody was divorced, and it was because the other party had committed adultery, and Jesus says, except in the case of adultery, where one party had broken the marriage covenant, and then the implication is that the other party, the innocent party, is free to remarry. Now, that exception is not given in Mark, but it's understood by somebody living in the ancient culture of that day, that has that Eastern thinking of that day, that Jesus is speaking in generalities, and that there are exceptions to the general rule, even though Mark does not state the exception. That's what I want you to see. Now, let me move from there to hospitality, and these are connected to those ideas of honor and shame, where to accept someone's hospitality gives honor to the person of whose hospitality you are accepting. So that if I go, and I remember seeing this in the Middle East, where I would perhaps go into a place, and the owner there, the homeowner, he would say, "Well, here, you have to have some tea." And I said, well, no, thank you. And my guide who was with me said, no, you really need to do that, because to refuse somebody's hospitality brings dishonor upon them. And I didn't get it. Not at the time. Looking back on it now, I realized how I was missing the point, because to accept somebody's hospitality gives honor to that person. And that is related to the idea of patronage. Again, something of a foreign concept to many of us in the West, where you would have a patron versus a client. A patron would be somebody of a high, or at least higher social standing than the client. Didn't have to be the very upper crust, but he is of a higher social standing, whereas the client is of a lower social standing, but with respect to the patron. They both might be quite high in society, or they both might be fairly low in society, but with respect to one another. And what makes them patron versus client is that the patron agrees to perform a service for the client, and he responds, he's expected to respond in that culture in gratitude, so that a service is performed, and then gratitude is owed. And of course, it's not just gratitude. It's like thank you, but I'm never going to do anything back. If the patron never needs anything, the client is going to respond with very visible gratitude. He's going to do a favor back to the patron. And so this sort of relationship would be present among a great many people, and sometimes we miss it when we see it in the Bible, because it is there. Let's look at an example in Luke chapter 7, beginning verse 2, where there was a centurion slave who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die, and when he, that is the centurion, heard about Jesus, notice he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come and save the life of a slave. Now notice he doesn't come himself. Why not? Well, he sends these intermediaries, and this is not a sign of disrespect. Quite the contrary. This was the acceptable social way of reaching out to somebody. You would go through an intermediary. And so you have the centurion, and we're going to find out in the story that he's the patron of the synagogue. And so who does he send? He goes to the Jewish elders. These are the people who are ruling the synagogue, and he has become their client by either repairing, I don't know if he built the synagogue or repaired it, but he was involved in a big way in bringing about the synagogue. And so they have become clients of the centurion, and they're going to go to Jesus now. And they're going to say, here's a man who is worthy. He is worthy of being our patron. And there's an unspoken hint, and maybe he might be worthy of being your patron too. If you do a favor for him, then he will maybe support your ministry. And so there's a question there: is Jesus going to be a potential client? And Jesus, if you've been reading through Luke up to this point, Jesus has been showing that he is the servant of God, the God of the universe. And so you almost expect him to say, oh, thanks, but no thanks. But instead he agrees to go. Notice verse 4. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, he is worthy. Notice he's worthy to be a patron. He's worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue. And so they've established their relationship with the centurion. A good man, a worthy man. Notice he's worthy for you to grant this. Verse 6, now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from them, the centurion sent, he's already sent the elders, but now he sends a second group of people, a second group of clients. He sends friends, and friends that's the language of a patron client. He sends friends to him saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself further. But notice what he says. He refers to Jesus very respectfully, Lord. That's a respectful greeting. And then he says, for I am not worthy. Now, we just read that he was worthy. That was his client speaking, the Jewish elders. But he himself sends a message, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason, so he's not coming to Jesus because he's too good for that, but rather just the opposite. He is honoring Jesus. He's saying, you're the real patron. I'm not even worthy to be your client, but I am asking a favor. I am approaching you not as a patron to a client, but I'm approaching you as a client to a greater patron, one who is greater than I. For I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason, I did not even consider, notice he says it again, I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. And he explains this, verse 8, for I also am a man placed under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and my slave, do this, and he does it. You see, he understands authority. He understands the patron-client relationship. He's explaining that. That's sort of the background of this entire conversation. And in verse 9, now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him. Now that's the language of being taken almost by surprise, where Jesus expresses a marvelous marveling. He expresses almost like a surprise and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. So that the language and the background of this patron-client relationship becomes a mirror by which you are able to see and determine a person's faith. Because after all, God is our patron. And this centurion gets that. And not only does he get it, he gets who Jesus is. And this is a mark of what Jesus calls such great faith. And verse 10 is almost anticlimactic. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Like I said, that's the rest of the story, but the big story was in seeing the faith shown by this patron-client relationship and his understanding of the real position of Jesus.